Jim Warner Wallace has spent his career building cases. As a former homicide detective, his job was to investigate the evidence and draw a conclusion based on those facts. Now, Jim is encouraging fellow Christians to build a case for the faith, and he's equipping them with the evidence they need.
Jim Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective and a former atheist.
If you had told me that I was a sinner, I would have laughed at you. I know what sinners look like. They're the folks I take to jail. That's not me. I'm a good guy.
But when Jim started checking out the Bible the same way he investigated a case, the evidence couldn't have been any clearer.
So I was willing to take a step with it and start to examine it as an eyewitness account.
In his book, Forensic Faith, Jim makes the case for Christians to be case makers for Christ and why it's vital to do so right now.
Jim Warner Wallace is with us now. And Jim, we welcome you back to the 700 Club.
Me. I so appreciate it. Yeah, good to be here.
Jim, I can't believe it, but you were a former atheist.
Yes.
What was the one piece of evidence that convinced you that God is real and that Jesus is his son?
You know, it's hard for me because I never usually build a case on one piece. If you do that and that one piece happens to be wrong or go to court later on and they're able to knock it down, you're kind of left flat-footed. Right. So I'm a cumulative case guy. I'm the kind of person who builds this case around 80 pieces of evidence that point. So for me, it was hard to come to faith that way. I spent 6 months, scanning through the scriptures, looking at the history of the first century, trying to make a case for why this was true cumulatively. And in the end, I was just overwhelmed with how reliable the eyewitness account. So I guess if there's one thing that struck me was that every way we test eyewitnesses in criminal trials, if you applied that same template to the authors of the Gospels, they passed the test.
Right.
And when I saw that happening right before my eyes, I said, okay, it's time for me to make a decision about Jesus.
Well, in your book, Forensic Faith, you talk about the difference between accidental versus evidential belief. What are the differences between those?
Okay, so I'm a Californian. Okay, if you ask me tell me something about California. What year was it founded? I really can't tell you. If you ask me how many square miles, I can't. How many counties? I can't. How do you pass a bill? What's the state tree? I couldn't answer any of these questions. But I was born in California. Yeah. Now, a lot of my Christian friends are Christians the way that I'm a Californian. They may have been raised in the faith. They're in the right place. But if you ask them many details about why they think it's the right place, they may not be able to answer them with anything other than their own experience. Now, that also works for my friends who are Mormons and Buddhists and Muslims. All of us have an experience that we can point to. The question is, do we have any good evidence to suggest that we're in the right place? And that's what we're trying to do with Forensic Faith.
And why is it so important for this generation of Christians to be able to defend their faith with not just, well, my parents were Christians or I go to church, but really with real evidence? Yeah,
let's face it, we're at a place right now where the culture says we've got objectively true things about identity, about marriage, about all kinds of things. And they want to make the case scientifically as an objective truth claim. Meanwhile, we hold what seems to be subjective opinions about religion. And anytime objective truths meet subjective opinions, be ready to get run over by the bus. And so what we're trying to say is, no, this is actually an objectively true claim about something that happened in the first century, the resurrection of Jesus, that stands up against all evidential scrutiny and deserves a place at the table of worldview ideas. That this is actually something that you could possess. Look, young people are leaving the church in record numbers, but we could stop that. At least we could address that. If young people want to leave because they just want to chase their passions, I get it. But if they're leaving because they don't think it's objectively true, then it's on us as their elder brothers and sisters in the church to be able to demonstrate to them why it is true and why eventually you will be back here with us, you will return with us, because in the end, it's hard to avoid the truth.
Jim, you encourage Christians to take a simple test. What are the questions that you ask?
Well, I've loaded the test, right? I've kind of loaded the test in a way that I see online. The kind of atheism we're seeing online is very aggressive. If you believe there's a God who created everything, well, who created your God? It's simple questions. If there's an all-loving God...
If we can answer that, then we are God.
Well, of course, but we have to be able to answer it in some way that it really kind of knocks down the objection and helps, is satisfying even personally. If someone said to you, well, if there's an all-loving, all-powerful God, why is there so much evil in the the world. Either he's not all loving, doesn't care to stop it, or he's not all powerful and he can't stop it. But if you believe he's all powerful and all loving, why doesn't he stop it?
How do you answer that question?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to our definition of evil. Why do we think that anything is evil to begin with? What standard are we applying to talk about true evil? Are you suggesting there's a true standard of righteousness by which we could judge something? Well, what would that true standard be? It turns out you need God as the true standard of righteousness before you could call anything evil to begin with.
Right.
Evil is not an evidence against God. It requires God in order to talk about it rationally. So I think we have to be able to prepare ourselves to answer these kinds of questions. I think you could have either an unreasonable faith, which is really against the evidence that exists. We don't have that kind of faith. Or you could have a blind faith. Right. That is, you don't even know what the evidence is, or you could have a forensic faith that is prepared to answer the question.
This is interesting. You say that the most important aspect of a criminal trial isn't the opening or closing arguments, but how the jury, it's picking the jury.
I know.
Why is that
Isn't
the
that
most
sad?
important?
It's not in the opening statement. It's not in the closing arguments. It's not even in the evidence show. We win trials at jury selection. If you don't pick the right 12 people, your 4 alternates, we're looking for 16 people who will actually be unbiased and will look at this fairly.
And what does that have to do with, with us, with
Well, the
Christians?
same thing is true for us. If you divide the entire world, there are people who are opposed to the prosecutor and people who are opposed to the defense attorney. The prosecutor does not want any people who are opposed to him in the box, and the defense attorney, we have the same situation as Christians. There are people who are against our worldview and people who are open to our worldview. Yeah. And once you identify the differences, it will change the way you approach them. There are some people we don't even put on a jury because we know they would never be fair. And there are times when we have to pray for people who are not yet ready to be on our jury because God has not yet moved them into the curious position. They're still anti-theists. They're against God. And those kinds of people I will spend time with, but I spend more time in prayer and more time modeling for that juror than I would for jurors who are already open.
Jim, you were a cold case homicide detective. That means you went and found the cases that nobody was looking at anymore. And you were an atheist.
Yes.
What was it that was going on in your life at that time that you said there's got to be more?
Well, my wife was somebody who was wanting to go to church, and she was also not a believer, but she was more willing than I was. And when we got to church, the pastor pitched Jesus on that particular day, as God would have it. He pitched Jesus as the smartest man who ever lived. That's what he said about him, and that made me very curious. So I bought a Bible and began this investigation, and that's what changed my life.
Wow! And your father is also a detective,
yes,
or was
and
a detective?
My son is now on the force as well. So we have 3 generations of Jim Wallace, all worked at the same agency since 1961.
Okay, so how should Christians respond when an unbeliever says, okay, I believe what you're saying. That may be true, but I'll never believe because Christians are just a bunch of hypocrites and bigots?
Yes, well, of course we're hypocrites. I mean, who would be more of a hypocrite than a Christian? Let's put it this way. As a non-Christian, I didn't have a standard anyone was aware of that I was trying to meet. As a Christian, I have a standard, and you all know who he is. He's Jesus of Nazareth. Now, once you have a visible, highest level standard, you will always fall short of it. So I would expect that, first of all of us are hypocrites in some way, but of all people, I think we are probably more likely to be seen as hypocrites only because we joyfully hold up the standard of Jesus for our own lives. Now, I could avoid being a hypocrite. Let me tell you how I do it. Have no standard. So those of us who have no standards cannot fail to meet their standards. Those of us who have a high standard will often fail to meet it.
Thank God for his grace, new mercies every day, and the blood of Jesus,
That's right, that's right.
Well, this is a fascinating book, Forensic Faith. Some are comparing it to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity.
Wow, that's way over the top.
You've heard.
Yes.
In fact, that book helped me so much in my mid-20s. That took me from seeking to full-on believer.
One of the very first apologetics books I read was
So
C.S.
if you've
Lewis.
read Mere Christianity, you might want to pick up this, Forensic Faith, a fascinating book. It's in stores nationwide. Jim Warner Wallace, thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for what you're doing. God bless you.